Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. I am so excited to keep season 10 going. Today we have a very special guest, Georg Northoff. He is a German Canadian psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and philosopher renowned for pioneering work in non reductive neurophilosophy and a novel approach known as spatio-temporal neuroscience. Holding the Canada Research Chair in Mind, Brain Imaging and Neuroethics at the University of Ottawa, he directs the Mind Brain Imaging and Neuroethics Research Unit at IMHR. His interdisciplinary research seeks to unravel how the brain constructs consciousness, the self, and emotions, bridging philosophy and neuroscience to revolutionize how we diagnose and treat mental illness. If you want to learn a little bit more about his work, you can find his all the things about him on his website at georgnorthoff.com. How are you doing today?
Good, very well. I hope you're well too.
Yeah, I am. We were just talking about Boston. You had lived here for 5 years. Well, how was your time in Boston? What were you doing out here?
So I was assistant professor at Harvard University and did some neuroscience and psychiatry there and had a very good time. Also
Yeah, I
met
mean, I
my
feel.
partner for life in Boston. Yeah, so
Oh,
yeah.
is she American too? Is she?
No, 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 Armenian.
Oh, okay,
Armenian.
cool, nice.
Uh,
That's so you've kind of experienced a lot of different cultures. You
right.
grew up in Germany and then you lived in the States for some time. You live in Canada now. How is that? I feel like it's always interesting to meet people who I feel like have a more international experience just because I think the way they even think about their work or
Mhm,
whatever it is that
mhm,
they're researching is very different because it takes cultural
mhm.
context sometimes into perspective. So, how do you feel like your international experiences has shaped your experiences as a researcher?
A lot. So I have also a lot of exposure to China, to the Chinese speaking world. I'm usually 2 times per year in China and in Taiwan, also in Japan, and also no more recently also in India. So, and that really has shaped me a lot. So, cultural context is key and has strongly shaped my view on mental features like self or consciousness. That we always need to put this into context, and that our brain is not just in here in the skull, but it's really a context-dependent organ. And just I always tell the joke about the difference in the perception of time. So Chinese and an American get together and speak about the French Revolution. And the Chinese ask, which is obviously 200 years ago. And the Chinese ask the American, what do you think about the French Revolution? Does it have an impact today? And the American asked, no impact at all. It's long past. It's not relevant for us in the present. Now, the American asked the Chinese, and the Chinese answers, it's way too early to tell whether the French Revolution has an impact now. So, meaning you see the time scales in which the two operate are completely different. Yeah. The
Hmm.
Chinese speaking world and also the Indian often put things into perspective, time perspective. Whereas I think the Anglo-American culture is more about the immediate here and now.
Hmm. I've actually often thought about this when it comes to the Gregorian calendar because I being able to say I live in 2025 makes me feel far more important than if I was to say I'm living in year 4.6 billion or whatever. If we were to start that calendar at a different time period,
It's true.
at any other point, you'd have to say such a larger number that you would have to, every time when you talk about date, confront the fact that you are just one of many, many, many. But because we're able to say 2025, it feels like not that many years have passed by. And I wonder how that makes an impact on the brain itself.
Yeah, I mean, the brain itself has different kinds of time scales, shorter and longer, and it connects through its own time scales to the time scales of the environment. I give you the classical example. Let's say, you play a certain music piece to your students, and they all suddenly uh, show the same rhythm. You tap your feet in the rhythm of the music, and you feel aligned. And then you see that certain other people, for them, it's maybe too fast. They cannot follow the rhythm or too slow. And importantly, that rhythm also then has a strong impact how you experience it. So these are shorter time scales
Mm.
of music, but longer time scales is the same thing.
Hmm. That's interesting. I mean, I feel like there are so many things I'm excited to ask you today because our last conversation was about well-being on the show, and we spoke. I spoke to a philosopher mainly talking about what does it even mean to be well? I mean, when we think about how that definition actually ends up impacting so many of our policy, our education, and we're now, I guess, stepping back one level and even talking more about identity itself now. What is the self? Who is the self? And so I'm really excited for today's conversation. But I wanted to just get kind of a background into who you are. How did you get interested and find your fascination working with the self?
There's a block. Okay. Can you just repeat because there was a interruption,
Yeah, yeah.
short interruption. I didn't get the full question.
I was just interested. I was just interested to know how you found your fascination in working with the self, especially understanding it through neuroscience.
So for that, I have to go back a little bit. So as a philosopher, I'm interested in brain-mind connection. That's really the theme, let's say, of my whole life as a researcher and philosopher. And brain-mind connection is for me about the subjectivity. So why do you experience something rather than nothing? And why do you experience the same situation in a slightly different way? Yeah. And so meaning, why aren't we just robots or maybe current AI, which does not have consciousness or experience and a sense of self? And for me, the self is this basic subjectivity. In the earlier philosophy, let's say in the Renaissance, René Descartes, in the Western world, tried to say, okay, experience consciousness is the mind, and body and brain are the non-mind. And of course, in his time, he didn't have access to all the tools with which we can now visualize the brain. But now we know that somehow what he called mind or consciousness or subjectivity is somewhat related to the brain. But we don't really know how it is related. And that's what fascinates me. And that was for me the beginning that I say, uh, how can I link the self to the brain? And very importantly, it's not that I say the self is the brain. I do not try to reduce it, but I say, how is it possible that the brain contributes and what does it contribute to our sense of self? And then, of course, I go into neuroscience. I also go into psychiatry because many of the mental disorders like schizophrenia or depression show basic sane changes in their sense of self.
Hmm. I mean, there's probably so much to get into here because I think one, it's really fascinating. The first thing I am curious to ask is before getting into how maybe people from different cultures differ in their conception of self, maybe first starting out with animals and other animals, other mammal species and humans, and talking about firstly, do other mammal species have a concept of self when they, and I know some do because I've heard of the dot test where they have a mirror and they're able to identify, but do other mammals have a sense of self?
Of course. Yeah, it may be not as extended as ours, but it has been shown. There's a famous mirror recognition test where basically the animal can see itself in the mirror and then say, "Rare, that's me." And clearly, chimpanzee pass the mirror test. We have now more biological data in preparation where we compared macaque, chimpanzee, and humans. And there are a set of different layers of regions in the brain. In the human brain, more basic regions beneath the surface of the brain, and the subcortical regions more on the surface, what is called the cortex. So different layers of regions which are related either to the inner body self, the outer body, your proprioception here, your skin, or when somebody touches you, and more your mental or cognitive self when you make yourself identify yourself or you attribute certain features to yourself. And what we show that the bottom layers of these regions are shared by macaque, chimpanzee, and humans. And but only the upper layer regions, the most mental layer here in the surface of the brain, the cortex, that they're slightly different. So of course they have a sense of self, but maybe not as extended in its temporal and spatial range as humans. So maybe they cannot go as much back to the past as we can do. Yeah.
Mm,
But they have a sense of a bodily self. This is my body as distinguished from other body. These are my outer body boundaries. And this is also me. So, and I think you can clearly see that in animals also, in behavior of the animals.
yeah. I mean, I think the reason that the deep connection between understanding the self and education is that I find sports stadiums to be the most fascinating thing for this particular reason because there's this arbitrary kind of concept that's been created called the sport where you throw a ball into a hoop or you kick a ball into a net. And over the years, all of a sudden, people start identifying with the team. They find brotherhood or companionship with others who wear the same colors, and they start developing animosity or hatred towards people who have different colors. And you create a whole concept of a self out of this made up human kind of game. And there's so many things that are like this, whether it's your job, whether it's your profession, you start identifying yourself as these things.
Uh-huh.
But the challenge of that is in one benefit, you have a clearer sense of who you are. But the downside of that is as you add more and more layers of that, you become more and more separate from those around you because they may not be in the same. I think India is a phenomenal example of this, where every person is so separated because you're separated either because of caste, because of profession, because of how much money you have, how many kids you have. There's so many things that separate you from the other that though you may have a strong sense of self, you have now lost the ability to, I think, deeply connect with a wide majority of the remaining people around you. So I think this concept of the self really does have deep ties to education. And so one thing I want to ask you is, have you noticed differences in how people define the self from where they feel like their essence belongs? Because in my head, I've always thought my essence belonged at my heart. I don't know why. Maybe there's some religious undertones to that, but I always thought when I think about who I am, I'm like, oh, it generates from where my heart is, and my heart is at the center, which isn't even true. My heart's moved off to the left, but I feel like I'm at the center. But I feel like that must come from a historical context too. So, yes, I'm just so curious. I mean, where do you think a lot of these changes kind of have occurred over time?
Yeah. I mean, let me first, you hinted upon a phenomenon which is particularly important for educators and teaching the young people. Yourself is intrinsically relational. You want to connect. Yeah. You're in a soccer team. You're part of the soccer team. You want to be, and you feel embedded in that, and that you feel synchrony. So we actually um, conducted a larger scale study where we asked subjects for their experience, feelings of synchrony with their own body, with their own self, with others, and the environment. And what we observed that people who showed the highest degree of synchrony with their own body and with the other and the environment felt emotionally the most stable and the best. And I think particularly for young people, where you undergo all these changes, physiological, psychological changes, let's say from 5 to 18 years, there's a lot of changes, hormonal changes, neuronal changes, psychological changes, context changes. I think it's very important to keep stable relationships within the family, but also outside the family, particularly if they become older and want to develop their own sense of self. How do you develop your own sense of self? Also strongly through your relationship to others. It's not just inside, and it's clear that if you don't have these relationships, you become more anxious, you become more depressed. So that's definitely a key feature. And I think people in the eastern part of the world, like in India or in particularly in China, in the Chinese-speaking world, and in Japan, they have a much stronger sense of relatedness of their sense of self than here in the Anglo-American world, where I define myself not through the relation to others, but rather through my difference. But I can also develop my own difference through different kinds of relationships with others. So, and that is really indeed also in mental disorders a key point where you lose your relationship to others. And that makes it very difficult for you to navigate. So, the other thing which you hinted about is about where is the location of the self. Of course, there's a whole history, culturally, strongly culturally dependent, obviously. And the heart was always a strong candidate for the seat of the soul, for the seat of the mind. And and I think I don't know the Indian philosophy so well. I'm sure it's somewhat in there. Um, so for me, the seat or the location of the self is really in between you and me. It's a relation. I'm that's I have a strong relational sense of self. It's not in here, it's not in my body. It's really in how I relate to other people and my context, the environment, the nature, the cultural context.
Hmm. I'm trying to remember. I mean, I took an existentialism class a long time ago, and is that did Heidegger believe something like that?
So Heidegger said we are being in the world, spoke of Dasein, Heidegger, philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century, existentialist. And definitely, so I think he touches upon a deep point here. We are always already being in the world. And that's true. I think he really captures the point. And I think this can be supported by current neuroscience and psychology. And that is actually what I'm trying to do. And when you read some of my papers, indeed, I have some papers where I discuss Heidegger.
Hmm. So when you talk about the self as like a relational self, how does that kind of shape the way you view yourself? Like, I mean, how does that, can you give an example of where a different model of understanding the self would lead to certain behaviors and having a relational understanding of self would lead to maybe a different kind of approach?
Yeah, I give you a personal example. So when you see me in China or in Japan, I behave slightly different than when I'm in Canada. And I make different jokes. So certain jokes I can make in China or in Taiwan or in Japan, which I cannot make in Canada. So myself is because they would not be understood. So it
Hmm.
really depends the relation, and I behave also slightly different. Yeah, whether I'm in Europe, in Italy, or in Germany already makes a difference, or whether I'm in China or in Canada or in USA. So I'm the still same person, and I often travel between all these different countries, and but I change my behavior. So the context shapes my behavior in that sense, yeah, and my
Hmm.
sense of self in that moment. And the alternative model would be, okay, I'm completely defined by my intrapsychological values and it's completely independent of the context. So I would behave the same way in all countries. And that's not the case. Of course, it's a balance. Yeah, it's not just either or context or self. What it is, and this balance is your relationship.
Hmm. I mean, this is really interesting because I had a conversation with a friend recently about this, where she had been with the partner for 10 years and he ended up cheating on her and it was a huge thing. And she was basically just telling me, she was like, I feel like I never knew him. And I think it comes down to a lot of what you're talking about here, because in my mind, what had come up was I think people can act often very differently based on the context that they're in. So if you're at a bachelor party and everyone's being kind of ridiculous, the types of behaviors you might engage in could be different than who you would in your routine, regular, domesticated life at home. But that doesn't necessarily mean you didn't know that person. It might just mean you didn't know that person in that context that they normally aren't around you. In the model that you pose, or just in general, the relational model of the self, what does it then mean to know another person? Is it not possible because you can only know them in relation to the context that they're in, and if their context changes, then you have to expect a new person?
I mean, the context in which I grow up strongly shapes my sense of self. Of course, you can somewhat transcend that. Um, and how you relate. So there is a relation, but that relation can be different. Yeah. So I think different people have different. So for instance, the Chinese students in my group, they individualize themselves through the relation. So the way they shape the relation slightly different than I would shape it. So I think it's not a Pandora's box where you always encounter a different self because it's a balance. So this would be, if you say each time is a different self, that would be it's either 100% context or 100% the person from within. But that's not the case. It's a balance that shapes your sense of self.
Hmm. I mean, I think where do you feel like neuroscience is leading with a lot of this research? I mean, what do you feel like is the end goal to kind of have this like objective definition of what the self is?
Good question. Where does this lead us? I think, of course, the ultimate for a researcher is to understand. Yeah, to understand nature, and part of nature is our sense of self and our brain. So that's just the fascination of the discovery, and that maybe your ideas, your data really converge and match with the reality out there. That's basically you're knocking on nature's door. That's, of course, for a researcher, the best feeling you can get when you have really feeling, maybe here what I'm doing and researching that maybe really mirror and related to what actually happens out there. That's one thing. So I think that's the fascination of research discovery, and scientists. The other is more practical thing. For me as a psychiatrist, in psychiatry, we currently do not have any diagnostic markers, biomarkers for differentiating different disorders like depression, like bipolar disorder, like anxiety, like schizophrenia or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, and as a clinician, and those biomarkers could then also improve the therapy, which is now currently more or less trial and error. You can give this antidepressant or that one, you have to try out. And look into other branches of medicine like cancer medicine or heart medicine, cardiology. Before you get therapy, you get 2 or 3 days of diagnostic, if not more. And that uh, shapes your therapy, meaning you can personalize the therapy based on the diagnostic. And that's something we currently cannot do in psychiatry. So I hope that understanding of these brain-mind connections, and for instance, the brain-self connection, would give us then ideally diagnostic markers, and then I can do better treatment and personalize the treatment. And that's exactly what we're trying to develop.
Hmm. What is the current model right now?
So the current model of psychiatric treatment is you get 5 to 10 minutes discussion with a psychologist or psychiatrist. Maybe you get some scales, some psychological scales, and then there's a set of criteria established, what is called the diagnostic manual DSM, and then you follow whether the criteria are met by the patient, certain symptoms, and then you make the diagnosis and then you treat. However, the diagnosis can differ between different psychiatrists, can also change over time. So there's a lot of problems. And then the treatment, yeah, we give you this antidepressant or that. We can see there's certain guidelines, but it's not really guided by the data from the individual subject, like in cardiology or cancer medicine.
Hmm. I mean, it is just really interesting because I think Living in the States, one of the things that I find to be really interesting is growing up, I had believed that who I was this extension to the things that I owned.
Mm,
There was always this connection to things. It was a very
mhm,
materialistic understanding of what it
mhm,
means to be. And as I've been traveling, which I feel like forces you to live out of a backpack and you have to, wear the same
mhm,
clothes, you start to kind of create this separation from things and who you are.
mhm,
And there was a time where I was learning a lot of different style forms of meditation, and I was going through that phase of my life, and I feel like that causes you to even break down those layers even more. Okay, so your body, and you keep peeling back the onion one layer at a time. What does a lot of more of those spiritual practices, are there some kind of findings in that kind of connect to what neuroscience is showing in the concept of self?
Yeah, very, very good question. Of course, forms of meditation, and you have an Indian background, and it's exactly it is. You do not define yourself by certain objects or things. Yeah, and that's what sometimes makes it very difficult for people to understand what do I mean by relation, because this is not something you can just grab and it's more virtual. Yeah. Um, and meditation is a fantastic example. So in the Indian tradition, there's this concept of non-duality, that you do not experience a difference between your sense of self and the environment anymore. So that you don't make this clear gap. Yeah. Instead, it's really a balance, and it's no longer a duality of here I am and here is the world, but it's more a direct immersion, the way I understand these experiences. You are part of the world. There's no longer a distinction between my inner self and the outer world. And then
Mm,
interestingly, we conducted a large scale meta analysis and also now more recent studies that people who experience, so in the brain, you have different kinds of regions. You have regions which are particularly important for connecting you direct to the world. These are called the sensory regions, like your auditory regions for, for auditory inputs or stimuli, the visual regions slash the visual cortex for mainly visual inputs. And then you have regions which are more, and these regions are more in the outer surface of the brain. And then you have regions which are more in the middle of the brain. uh, you might have heard the default mode network. And these regions are more called of the higher order regions. They're related to your cognition. They have been associated with your sense of self. Um, and usually there's a certain balance called or gradient. So the regions in the middle here, the higher order regions, are more very active and have very long time scales. They activate for longer, versus the regions, the sensory regions, the auditory visual regions, which connect you directly to the environment, have more shorter time scales because they need to be more flexible given all the various stimuli and inputs. And usually there's a certain gradient between these regions, meaning you have longer time scales in the higher order regions in the middle of your brain here, and shorter time scale, as I said, in the sensory regions. And interestingly, this gradient is no longer there. It's flat. It's no longer like this, but it's flat in the people who have non-dual experiences, meaning they don't make a difference between their inner self-processing and the outer environment processing within their brain. So it's flat, and meaning you don't experience that difference anymore between yourself and the environment. But it's one, non-dual experiences.
wow. And so what causes the other? Is it that you change your intellectual perception of the world and then that ends up manifesting in the brain, or is it just that their brain was already a little different than that caused them to go in that direction?
It's training. That's training. That's so you reorganize your brain. Originally, your brain has sort of this somewhat duality between the inner self and the outer environment, but then you can change. Your brain is very plastic. Yeah, it changes, and you know this. Uh, the young students who many of the audiences teach, They change, they plastic over time. When you have the same student over years, you see how they change and adapt. So your brain is a very adaptive and changing organ, but sometimes it takes longer. It's not right away, but it takes 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or years. And that's exactly what you can see. And it's clear that these expert meditators who experience non-dual experience have to practice over years, and then they get into a non-dual experiential state, which is literally mirrored also in the non-dual state of your brain, because your brain doesn't make a difference anymore between your sensory environmental processing and your higher order self processing.
Mm. Huh, this is interesting. So there's two questions that come up to my mind. But the first one is, so is it possible that based on your understanding of the world, and if your brain is realigned to that, could two people have very different truths and both be true at the same time just because their initial belief caused a change in their brain?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, because the brain is always balancing between the inner and the outer. So I grew up with certain beliefs, and these beliefs with inner beliefs. And these beliefs strongly shape how I perceive the outer environment, meaning you and I can perceive the same outer environment in completely different ways. Why? Depending on my initial beliefs and our differences in that. And that's a key point. So the brain has to be understood as always this negotiating between inner and outer. Yeah, it's a constant balancing. It's basically like dancing a tango. Yeah, two people dance a tango and they constantly try to adjust each other to the rhythm of the music. Yeah,
Mm,
and same here, the brain constantly try to adjust and balance its inner and outer relative to what is going on in the environmental context.
mm. So to understand a person or a self, it's not enough to simply understand them, and it's not also simply enough to understand their context. It's like you said, a dance between constantly. Hmm.
Yeah. It's, for instance, you really need to understand the context. For instance, let's say I often imagine myself if I had grown up 100 years earlier. So if I had grown up at the beginning of the 20th century, I probably wouldn't have become a neuroscientist. I probably would have become a physicist. Yeah, because that was the question at the time. And then I would have still studied philosophy, but probably physics. Yeah, because that was the question at the time. And everybody, a researcher, scientist like me, of course, is shaped in her or his questions by the respective context in which you grow up.
Hmm. I mean, how fascinating is that? I mean, I think that I mean, it's truly so. Okay, well, then here's another question for you. So, when it comes to understanding the self, let's say one understanding of who I am allows me to actually navigate around other people in a more kind of empathetic way, and it allows me to form more connections and things like that. But let's say that actually deviates from the quote unquote truth, hypothetically. Would it still be worth it to know the essence of what the self is if like that doesn't actually help connect you with other humans and what if the true nature of the self is actually once you understand that you actually become isolated? Let's just say hypothetically.
I mean, see, any kind of science is only approximate. Yeah, you can never capture the truth as it is by itself, but you can see whether our concepts and data about the self somehow match with the outer reality. So, for instance, I try to manipulate certain things on the self. Let's say, for instance, it's time perception, and whether that changes some of our mental features. Then I can say, yes, time perception seems to be a key factor in our sense of self, because otherwise your perception of yourself wouldn't change. So it's always an indirect way, an approximate way through matching, through comparison. and you can come closer or more distant. Yeah, this is always, that's the way science and ultimately philosophy work. Yeah, we don't have direct access to the world as such because, just let's face it, the world has a much broader range of time scales going back 200, 300, 400 years, and if not more in other cultures. Um, Evolution has a much longer time scale yet, compared to the very limited number of our consciousness, for instance. We have consciousness of 30 to 50 milliseconds to 3 to 5 seconds. And that's the end of our consciousness. So it's a very small time scale range compared to the time scale range which is out there. Now, you initially asked the other species. For instance, bats. It's a very famous example in philosophy. What is it like to be a bat? And a bat has ultrasonar waves. So it's a time scale we as humans with our brain cannot process. Then there are whales. Whales, they have very long time scales, and that enables them to communicate them over long stretches of time. We cannot do that. Yeah,
Whoa. So their sense of self must be expanded because they're able to communicate.
correct.
Ah.
Correct.
Ah, that's so interesting. So, okay, so what do you think are some of the defining characteristics of humans that shape our sense of self?
Compared to other species. I mean, it's our time scale range of, for instance, our consciousness, 30 to 50 millisecond to 3 to 5 seconds, versus other species have other time scale ranges. One thing which seems to be really specific for human, because the brain became much bigger. The surface of the brain, the cortex, really is very much enlarged in humans compared to even chimpanzees and macaques. And there's no doubt that we are faster in learning. So usually I'm not somebody who emphasizes differences between humans and other species, but rather the similarities, because it's a shared evolution. And that is still there. We share the lower layers and probably middle and partially the upper layers of our brain with other species. That's why we can connect. But there's no doubt that the learning abilities are better in humans than in even apes, chimpanzee, and macaque. For instance, the same kind of, let's say, short-term memory task. For us, we learn it in 2 minutes, and you need to train the monkey for 6, 7 months for that. So there is a real difference there in the cognition. There's no doubt.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is really interesting because I think one of the saddest parts of being in philosophy and just in any of these spaces is that you don't get to live for 10,000 or 100,000 years to just see the types of things that humans get to come up with and just to know what the world looks like so far from now. And you're left to just fiction, which is great. But I'm just curious for you because I think I love asking this to most philosophers. They're just people who spend their time in academia. In your best case situation, 10,000 years from now, what would you, maybe hope or like to see a lot of your work or research maybe turn into? Or is it kind of, yeah, where does it lead to, do you think?
Now, first and foremost, I hope that the Earth and the humans are still there in 10,000 years, which we cannot be sure, given the stupidities they do. So, no doubt. What I would like to see, I mean, I hope that I can contribute to really how the brain mind works, meaning that we do not have to assume some mysterious artificial entities. But we can say maybe your sense of self is just okay, your brain processes a little longer, and the longer it processes, just a matter of time scales, the stronger your sense of self compared to the other inputs which are not processed as long. So, meaning what I want to say here, it's a purely temporal and ultimately, of course, spatial thing. There's no magic This is nature. Yeah. Nature is extremely creative, but it doesn't do magic. It doesn't do metaphysics. So I think that would really give us a better understanding of what the mind is about. So it's a very biological view, as you can see, and of course based on physics, but not a reductive view. That's one thing which I hope, let's say, on the basic side, that we have just better understanding and insight and just knowledge. Yeah. Nowadays we know we have genes. 50, 60 years ago, we didn't know that. So people assumed a life energy. Now we assume, okay, now it's the genes. That's the same, I would say, look, it's the temporal spatial dynamics of your brain and how it relates to the spatial temporal dynamics of your environment that creates your sense of self or your consciousness. So that's on the basic science, on just the knowledge thing, what I would love to see. And I can see that younger people now are very open to this. They understand some of this. Um, on the practical side, and this is a real important thing for me as a psychiatrist, I hope that we can really have a diagnostic and therapy in psychiatry like we have now in heart medicine, cardiology, or in cancer medicine. Because then we can really much better help these mental disorders and the people in therapies. That's what I really hope, and really improves their lives, and making it a normal medicine, this normal medical discipline. Because
Hmm.
look for cancer medicine. 30, when I studied medicine, cancer wasn't developed as well as now. You can't imagine what kind of diagnostic you do, and many of the forms of cancer can be now treated. And also completely reversed. That's what I hope the same for mental disorders.
Hmm. And is it because the part that I think I'm missing is by understanding the self, how does that lead to the improved mental health outcomes?
So many of the mental disorders like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia are basic disturbances of yourself. If your self is abnormal, you have experienced abnormal emotions. Your thoughts become abnormal. Your movements become abnormal. For instance, if your self is too slow, literally, your self is too slow. That's, for instance, what happens in depression. Yeah, and you can measure that on the psychological level as well as in the brain itself. Now, if your self is too slow, all the emotions the self experiences are too slow. You become sad. Nothing changes anymore. No change, abnormally slow. Look at its seaside where no waves at all, completely flat. The first 10, 15 minutes, you will enjoy it, you calm down. Now I force you to look at the same seaside without any change for the next 10 hours. I'm sure you become depressed. Yeah, that's exactly what happens in the brain mind of these people. When your self is too slow, your movements become too slow. You don't move anymore. Your emotions don't change. You become sad. Your thoughts are very sluggish.
Hmm.
Yeah. Your perception is too slow. You cannot follow faster events in the outer environment. This is all based on data, what I'm saying here. Then now, what you can do, if you know that my sense of self has a certain speed, slow speed, then I can try to make it faster and improve the speed. But what is a slow speed for myself is not the same what is a slow speed for you, because you grew up in a different context, you have a different physiological constitution. So what is slow for me, maybe not slow for you, or vice versa. So meaning I need to look for your individual speeds. Go to heart medicine, you go to cardiology, you go on the treadmill, and they test how your heart reacts to increasing loads on the treadmill, how fast you can run. Yeah, and then you see the capacity of your heart for different speeds. And that's very different. Same in the case of the brain and the self. And if we know that, basically the treadmill test for the speed of the self, then we can
Hmm.
properly diagnose and therapy.
Whoa. So this is your practice. I get it now. That's actually so interesting.
That's what we're trying to develop. We, for instance, already developed a breathing therapy with a breathing speed which is really tailored to your individual person. We we also already conduct that in studies for clinical use and also for music. We change the speed of the music, and then of course we want to also develop more brain-based measure the speed of the brain and your speed of the self on the psychological level, and then see how we can manipulate that in the respective disorder.
Mm. I have one more question, and this is just more of like a personal curiosity question I have for you. But a lot of my family grew up in a highly religious
Mhm,
society that I wouldn't even consider religious, but I would say traditional more so, where there was kind of these beliefs where, like you said, when there are things that necessarily, who are you? What does it mean to be? And there's
mhm,
not so much science necessarily that kind of backs something. They have some belief in something that gives them some meaning or understanding of the world or themselves. But I find that people who grew up like that oftentimes do appreciate science because they kind of rebel against
mhm,
the over
mhm,
kind of simplification. So I think my dad is somebody
mhm,
like that who really, really
mhm,
loves science because he experienced the opposite growing up.
mhm,
But in
mhm,
my household, for example, which wasn't very religious, wasn't very traditional,
mhm,
sometimes I like and I find comfort in the mysticism of
mhm,
I don't necessarily believe that there's a soul, but even sometimes thinking that gives way to this. I think when you read poetry, for example, the number of poems that
mhm,
talk about this essence of a soul, I think creates this beauty in understanding what it means to be that if I was to read a science paper, I just would not feel that kind of and I don't know, maybe that's because science
mhm.
papers aren't written poetically, and maybe if they were, I would feel that there as well. But I just feel like sometimes I wonder if we lose the kind of mysticism with all these things, the world becomes a little bit more cold because we've understood it all. Do you ever feel that way?
Yeah, you see me smiling. That touches upon very many layers. So I do think that good science, really good science, deep science, should give you goosebumps, meaning it touches upon true reality. And that's the same with religious, spiritual practices. You become embedded in a larger whole. Yeah, you are aware of your basic roots, where you come from, literally. Yeah, the Chinese word, the Taoism, harmony with nature. Yeah, and I think for me, on a personal level here, that always, when I have the feeling I see findings, wow, it could really be like this in reality. That gives me goosebumps because there's a matching. I become part of reality and I see go very deep to my very unconscious, deep, 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 deep layers. Yeah, which we share with the environment because we are evolutionary, we come from there. And I think for me, spiritual practices, beliefs, religious practices, across the different religions, you see a lot of commonalities. You see group chanting in Buddhism, in Christianity, yeah, in Islamic. See, these are variations. You see rituals, yeah, to rituals to embed you, to relate you to your context, to the other, to your fellows, to the larger context. Yeah. And I think these are basic experience we have the capacity for. Yeah. Of course, sometimes they become very manipulated and taken advantage of by other people. This is something which I obviously don't like. But I think there's a deep, deep truth. And the Indian culture, you mentioned it, has, I mean, I now get through my weekly group meetings with the Indian group. We get into meditation, I get into the culture, how these different forms of meditation evolved, what is the philosophical background. It's unbelievable. And all these layers of culture, intergenerational, are still somewhat present in you. Yeah. And I really think that's and it's we need to go beyond if you just stick to yourself, it's not good for you. Now I speak as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. You need to relate to your others. And all these religious practices, spiritual practices are part of that. Mindfulness in the Western world, the different forms of meditation in India and in other parts of the world. Key. This is part of human nature. Yeah. And I think you integrate yourself through these practices as part of nature and your more basic layers.
Mm. So in some senses, the best sciences help you connect,
I
possibly.
would definitely so say. I mean, this is look what Einstein did. Einstein connected us to the environment in a much deeper way than Newton did.
Mm.
Yeah, and that's for me science. So maybe in 100 years, there's another guy and said, "Yeah, Northoff, your spatial temporal neuroscience is great, but it's not sufficient. We need a different approach." You said, "Welcome. Please knock on my grave and tell me." Yeah. That's what science. I stand on the shoulders of my predecessors, and my successors will hopefully stand on my shoulders. And if they do, then
Mm.
I have a knocked on one of the right doors in environment, but they can show, look, I show you the house of the door on which you knocked. Great, fantastic.
How cool is being human, huh?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's so cool. We get to spend our whole life, I mean, questioning things like what does it mean to be human or what does it mean to be me? I mean, that's so special.
that's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm really glad our brain figured out how to do that, just to question itself, that level
That's
of,
true.
yeah.
That's a good point, and that's probably something specific to humans. Probably other animals don't have developed a complete science or philosophy like that, and that's culture. I mean, that's part of culture, and this is and people always did this. I mean, look, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, when you're in a Taiwan Museum, National Museum, you see artifacts from 10,000 before Christ from the old Chinese culture. It is unbelievable.
Mm.
Incredible. I agree. Indian culture, unbelievable. I agree.
This has been an amazing conversation. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and taking the time and sharing your insights and wisdoms, but this has been an amazing time.
Mhm. Thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm excited to keep up with your work and see, and I think a lot of this stuff is really fascinating. I want to understand a little bit more in the next few weeks and months, just like understanding
Mhm.
this concept of slowness and move and how that
Mhm.
impacts
Mhm.
our ability to move through the world. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you see, there are more YouTube talks where I also discuss about spatial temporal psychopathology. You can I mentioned some of that in discussion.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Perfect. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I want to just say, I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This was an amazing addition to this season to understand and even start questioning what does it really mean to be and what does it mean to be us. And so I hope you
Mhm.
enjoyed. Have a great week. And
Yeah.
as per usual, stay re educated.
Okay.